The neighborhood of Willow Creek was the kind of place people dreamed of moving to. Perfectly trimmed lawns, neat driveways, and quiet evenings gave the illusion of harmony and order. But beneath that polished surface lurked the watchful eyes of the Homeowners Association, a board that prided itself on strict enforcement of every rule, no matter how trivial. For most residents, the HOA was an inconvenience, an occasional letter about lawn height or garbage bins left out too long. Annoying? Yes, but manageable. Yet for some, it became a relentless presence, creeping into every corner of their lives. And for one man in particular, the HOA was about to go too far. His name was Mark. A retired engineer in his late 50s, Mark had lived in Willow Creek for nearly a decade. His house wasn't the largest on the block, but it was his sanctuary, a place he had maintained with pride and care. He was not reckless with rules, nor careless with appearances. His lawn was cut, his shutters painted, his driveway swept clean. Yet one quiet morning, as he opened his front door, he found a bright orange notice taped to the wood. It was an HOA violation letter, bold and official, declaring that his property was non-compliant. The letter claimed that his driveway had cracks deemed unsightly, and his fence showed signs of wear. If the issues weren't fixed immediately, heavy fines would begin to accrue. At first, Mark brushed it off as an exaggeration. He had patched his driveway just the year before, and his fence, while not brand new, was sturdy and freshly stained. He suspected it was another instance of overzealous nitpicking. But the letters didn't stop. Week after week, more notices arrived, each harsher than the last. Soon, fines began to pile up, climbing into the thousands. The HOA insisted his property was dragging down the neighborhood's appearance and warned that if he did not comply, legal action could be taken. Mark was stunned. He had always paid his dues, always respected the rules, always kept his home in good condition. Yet here he was, treated like a negligent outsider. He began to suspect it wasn't about his driveway or fence at all. Rumors swirled in Willow Creek that the HOA president, a woman named Cynthia, had her eyes on certain properties she wanted for herself or her allies. Some said she targeted homeowners until they gave up and sold at a discount, allowing her circle to buy cheaply. The more Mark thought about it, the more it made sense. His house sat on a corner lot with a wide yard and easy access, prime real estate for anyone looking to profit. Suddenly, the endless letters and fines seemed less like random enforcement and more like a calculated plan to push him out. At first, Mark tried reason. He submitted photographs of his property, proof of recent repairs, and receipts for maintenance. But every appeal was denied. The board claimed his evidence was insufficient or out of date. It became clear to him that they weren't interested in fairness. They were determined to break him down. The pressure grew heavier when he received a certified letter in the mail. The HOA had placed a lien on his property. If the supposed violations weren't corrected and the fines paid, they could move to foreclose on his home. In one stroke of a pen, the sanctuary he had worked for all his life was under threat. The weight of it was suffocating. Each morning, Mark woke with dread, wondering what new notice would appear. Each evening, he stared at the house he loved, wondering if he'd be forced to leave it behind. Friends told him to give in, to fix what the HOA demanded, to pay the fines and move on. But deep down, he knew compliance wasn't the answer. This wasn't about cracks in a driveway or a fence panel. This was about control, greed, and intimidation. Mark wasn't the kind of man to bow to bullies. He had spent a lifetime solving problems others said were impossible. And as the HOA circled closer, he began to realize that if they wanted a fight, he was prepared to give them one. Late one night, as he sifted through the stack of violation letters piled on his desk, a plan began to form. He would not be their victim. He would not let them steal his home under the guise of community standards. He would fight them on their own terms, with persistence, and with the law itself. The battle for his house had begun, and though the HOA thought they had him cornered, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The weeks that followed were a storm of paper, threats, and tension. The HOA had tasted control and now wanted the whole house. Mark, who had always enjoyed quiet mornings with coffee on his porch, now found his days consumed with documentation, research, and preparing for what was becoming a full-scale war. Every few days, a new notice arrived, One claimed his lawn wasn't the correct shade of green. According to HOA standards, another accused him of storing unauthorized equipment in his backyard, a reference, Mark realized bitterly, to the small shed where he kept his gardening tools. The absurdity of the accusations grew with each letter, but the intent was clear: overwhelm him with so many violations that he would either give up or make a costly mistake. Neighbors began to notice. Some whispered words of sympathy when Cynthia and her board weren't looking, but most stayed silent. The HOA had a reputation for retaliating against anyone who spoke out. The fear was contagious, and Mark could see it in the way neighbors avoided eye contact when he walked down the street. He wasn't just fighting for his house anymore. He was being made into an example. The pressure deepened when the HOA took their threats public. A notice was pinned to the community bulletin board declaring that his property was under review for significant non-compliance. It painted him as negligent, irresponsible, and a burden to the neighborhood's image. Seeing his name posted like a criminal's was a humiliation Mark hadn't anticipated. He knew it was strategic. Cynthia wanted him ostracized, isolated, easier to crush. But humiliation soon turned to anger. He began to dig deeper into the HOA's operations. Late nights were spent combing through bylaws, reviewing legal precedents, and reaching out to advocacy groups that specialized in HOA abuse. The more he uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Cynthia and her allies had a history of targeting homeowners with vague violations, burying them in fines, and then seizing their properties when they couldn't keep up. It wasn't just his imagination, it was a scheme. Mark kept meticulous notes. He took photographs of his property from every angle, documenting the supposed issues. He gathered receipts and service records for every repair and maintenance task he had completed. He even began recording interactions with HOA representatives, knowing that every word could matter later. Slowly, he was building not just a defense, but a counterattack. Yet as he prepared, the HOA pushed harder. One morning, a notice came that his mailbox and HOA-approved design he had installed years ago was suddenly non-compliant with new standards. He was given 10 days to replace it at his own expense. Another letter threatened immediate legal action if he didn't repaint his shutters, despite them being freshly painted. Each demand was more ludicrous than the last, and each one carried another fine. The financial strain was mounting. The HOA had already piled thousands of dollars in penalties onto his account. Their lien grew heavier with every fabricated violation. For most homeowners, this kind of pressure would have forced a surrender. But for Mark, it only steeled his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his home anymore, he was fighting to expose them. The breaking point came when he received notice of a scheduled inspection. A group of HOA board members would be arriving to evaluate his property. The wording was smug, almost gleeful, as if they relished the idea of catching him off guard. Mark knew what it meant. They intended to fabricate even more violations, perhaps even use the inspection as a pretext to justify foreclosure proceedings. But what they didn't know was that Mark had prepared for this moment. He had already installed cameras around his property, recording everything that happened on his land. He had witnesses lined up, neighbors who, though cautious, had agreed to quietly testify to the condition of his home. He was ready to turn their inspection into evidence of their harassment. The day of the inspection arrived, and with it, the HOA's smug entourage. Cynthia herself led the group, clipboard in hand, striding across his lawn as though she already owned it. They poked, measured, and scribbled notes, every gesture dripping with disdain. Mark remained calm, watching from a distance, his cameras capturing every move. By the time they left, Cynthia's smile made it clear they believed they had found what they needed. More violations would surely follow. More fines, more threats. But Mark knew something they didn't. Their arrogance was giving him exactly the proof he needed. That night, as he reviewed the footage, he felt a surge of determination. The HOA thought they had cornered him, but in their overreach, they had exposed themselves. He wasn't just defending his home anymore, he was preparing to turn the full weight of their own greed back on them. The war was escalating, and Mark was no longer on the defensive. The HOA believed they had tightened the noose, The stack of violation notices now filled an entire drawer in Marcus' HOA office, and the fines had reached a number so outrageous it looked more like a mortgage payment than a penalty. Cynthia and her board must have felt confident that he would soon buckle under the pressure, forced to hand over his house. But Mark had no intention of For weeks, he had quietly worked on building a case. He knew the HOA operated under the assumption that homeowners were too intimidated, too broke, or too uninformed to fight back. They thrived on silence and resignation. But Mark was neither silent nor resigned. He had been through worse in his life, and compared to the battles he had already fought, this one was just another mission. The first step was to expose the lies. He carefully compiled a dossier, a thick binder filled with photographs, dated receipts, correspondence, and video evidence. Each supposed violation was countered with proof that the claims were baseless. His lawn, regularly serviced by a landscaper, was perfectly within standards. His shutters, freshly painted, matched the HOA's approved color palette. Even the mailbox, the so-called non-compliant model, was identical to those installed by dozens of other residents. The more he documented, the clearer the pattern of selective enforcement became. But Mark knew paperwork alone wasn't enough. HOA boards like Cynthia's thrived on control of perception. They twisted stories to paint themselves as protectors of the neighborhood. If he wanted to win, he had to challenge that narrative. Quietly, he began reaching out to neighbors. At first, many were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. But as he showed them his evidence, some began to open up. Stories spilled out accounts of others who had been fined for frivolous reasons, bullied into costly repairs, or even threatened with foreclosure over minor disputes. What shocked him most was learning that 2 families had already lost their homes under Cynthia's leadership. The official story was always that they had failed to comply or abandon their obligations, but neighbors whispered that it had been the HOA's relentless harassment that had driven them out. Cynthia had gained a reputation for targeting anyone she disliked. And once she set her sights on someone, she never let go. Mark realized that he wasn't alone. There was a pattern of abuse that stretched far beyond his own situation. And if he could gather enough voices, he could turn this from a personal fight into a community uprising. The turning point came during a late-night research session. He stumbled upon state laws governing HOAs and discovered several clauses that limited what boards could legally enforce. More importantly, he learned about statutes prohibiting selective enforcement and financial mismanagement. With a sinking but vindicated feeling, Mark recognized that Cynthia's board had crossed those lines repeatedly. Their greed hadn't just been immoral, it had been illegal. Armed with this knowledge, Mark crafted his counterstrategy. He contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, someone with a reputation for dismantling corrupt boards. He handed over his binder of evidence and watched as the lawyer's expression shifted from polite interest to astonishment. It was a goldmine of proof far stronger than what most homeowners brought to the table. But Mark didn't stop there. He knew the court of public opinion mattered as much as any courtroom. Discreetly, he began spreading word among his neighbors, not with anger or desperation, but with calm facts. He showed them the evidence, explained the laws, and reminded them of their own experiences. Little by little, the fear that had kept everyone silent began to crack. People started to realize that if they stood together, the HOA couldn't intimidate them all. Meanwhile, Cynthia pressed forward, oblivious to the storm forming around her. A new notice arrived, declaring that Mark's fines had reached the point of foreclosure proceedings. She likely expected him to panic, to beg for leniency, or to quietly sell his home and vanish. Instead, Mark smiled for the first time in weeks. This was the move he had been waiting for, the overstep that would expose their scheme completely. The next HOA meeting was unlike any other. Cynthia strutted in with her usual air of authority, flanked by board members ready to rubber stamp her decisions. But, this time, the room was packed. Neighbors who had long stayed away filled the seats, their faces tense but determined. Mark stood near the back, binder in hand, waiting for his moment. When Cynthia announced the intention to move forward with foreclosure, murmurs rippled through the crowd. That was when Mark stepped forward. Calmly, methodically, he presented his evidence. He laid out photographs, receipts, video recordings, and legal citations. Every accusation against him unraveled under the weight of proof. Every selective enforcement was highlighted, every fabricated violation exposed. And then came the testimonies. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke up, confirming the harassment they too had faced. Cynthia's composure faltered. She tried to interject, to dismiss the claims, but the tide had shifted. The room was no longer under her control. The neighbors were no longer afraid. Mark wasn't finished. He revealed that a lawyer was now involved, that legal action for harassment, selective enforcement, and potential fraud was being prepared. Gasps filled the room as he explained that the HOA's financial records would soon be audited, and any mismanagement would be brought into the light. For the first time, Cynthia looked unsettled. The smug confidence she had carried like armor began to crack. She had underestimated Mark, assuming he would crumble like the others. Instead, she had awakened an adversary who was smarter, more determined, and now backed by both law and community. The meeting ended in chaos, with Cynthia storming out and the board scrambling to maintain order. But Mark knew this was just the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to roll over easily, and Cynthia would certainly plot her next move. Yet the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, Mark was no longer the hunted. He was the one leading the charge. And as he walked home that night, binder still clutched under his arm, he felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Cynthia left that meeting with her pride in tatters. 4 years, she had reigned over the HOA with unquestioned authority, wielding fines and violations like weapons. No one had ever dared confront her so openly, and certainly not with such damning evidence. Mark's bold move hadn't just challenged her. It had fractured the illusion of control she worked so hard to maintain. But Cynthia was not one to admit defeat. To her, losing meant humiliation. And humiliation was unacceptable. She believed the only way to maintain her power was to escalate, to strike back harder, to silence the rebellion before it grew. And so, the retaliation began. The first sign came in the form of sudden emergency rules passed by the board. Overnight, new restrictions appeared. Limits on parking, curfews for outdoor activities, even bans on certain garden decorations. Though they were written to look general, the rules seemed to target homeowners sympathetic to Mark's cause. A family who had spoken in his defense at the meeting was fined for parking a guest's car in their driveway overnight. Another neighbor who had voiced support found themselves accused of unauthorized landscaping. The message was clear: anyone who sided with Mark would pay. Mark himself became the central target. Within days, his mailbox was vandalized. The HOA denied responsibility, of course, but the timing was no coincidence. Then came the late-night phone calls, silent, unsettling interruptions that always ended with a click. Mark installed security cameras and documented everything, refusing to be intimidated. He knew that Cynthia's desperation was proof that his strategy was working. The harassment extended beyond paperwork and intimidation. The HOA began spreading rumors, whispering that Mark was unstable, that he was endangering property values, that his resistance was a selfish act, dragging down the entire neighborhood. Cynthia used her influence to twist reality, portraying herself as the victim of a hostile homeowner who was disrupting community harmony. Some residents, unwilling to confront the truth, clung to her narrative, choosing comfort in her lies rather than facing the corruption in front of them. But for every neighbor who turned away, another quietly came to Mark with their story. He became a quiet rallying point, the person people sought when they were tired of the constant pressure and harassment. What Cynthia didn't realize was that her heavy-handed tactics were pushing more residents into his corner. Each act of retaliation revealed her fear, and with fear came mistakes. The legal process was slow, but Mark's lawyer reassured him they were building an airtight case. The selective enforcement, the financial mismanagement, the intimidation tactics, each piece was documented. Still, Cynthia seemed determined to force a crisis before the courts could intervene. That crisis came in the form of a foreclosure notice, delivered in a thick envelope with an official seal. The notice declared that the HOA had initiated proceedings to seize Mark's property. They claimed his unpaid fines had reached a level that justified foreclosure. To the untrained eye, the document looked legitimate and terrifying. But Mark knew better. He had been expecting this. The notice was riddled with irregularities, incorrect dates, missing signatures, and blatant exaggerations of the amounts owed. More importantly, his lawyer had already filed motions disputing the validity of the fines themselves. It was a scare tactic, designed to pressure him into but instead of caving, Mark turned it into ammunition. He shared the notice with his neighbors, showing them how the HOA was attempting to take his home under false pretenses. The outrage was palpable. Even those who had remained neutral began to see the truth. If Cynthia could do this to him, she could do it to anyone. The fear that had once kept the community silent was transforming into anger. The tension in the neighborhood reached a breaking point. Conversations that once avoided HOA topics now buzzed with dissent. Families whispered about organizing, about voting out the board, about demanding accountability. For the first time, Cynthia's grip on the community was visibly slipping. Sensing this, Cynthia doubled down. She called a special HOA meeting, one that was closed to non-board members. Rumors spread that she intended to push through measures, granting the board even greater power, including the ability to fast-track foreclosures without homeowner approval. To her, this was a war, and she was determined to win at any cost. But what she didn't know was that Mark was already one step ahead. He had anticipated her moves and was prepared to counter them with something she hadn't expected: outside intervention. His lawyer had quietly contacted state regulators, and an investigation into the HOA's practices was underway. Cynthia's empire, built on fear and manipulation, was about to face scrutiny from authorities who wouldn't be intimidated by her bluster. As Cynthia plotted her next strike, Mark waited patiently, binder of evidence thicker than ever, neighbors rallying more with each passing day. The HOA thought they had cornered him with foreclosure, but in reality, they had walked into their own trap. The stage was set for the confrontation that would either break Cynthia's hold forever or plunge the community into deeper chaos. The special meeting Cynthia had orchestrated was supposed to be her chance to tighten her grip. Behind closed doors, she rallied her board members with promises of swift action and authority. She painted Mark as a dangerous agitator whose rebellion had to be crushed. Before it infected the rest of the community, her plan was to ram through measures that would give the board sweeping new powers, including expedited foreclosure procedures. But even as she stood at the head of that private meeting, declaring victory, forces outside her control were closing in. Mark's lawyer had already filed multiple complaints with state regulators. The evidence binder, paired with sworn statements from several residents, was compelling enough to warrant official scrutiny. What had once been just neighborhood drama was now a case file sitting on the desks of investigators. It began subtly. A letter arrived at the HOA office, demanding access to financial records. At first, Cynthia dismissed it as routine. But when investigators followed up with a formal request and a deadline, her composure slipped. She knew their books weren't clean. For years, she had used HOA funds for questionable expenses: lavish dinners billed as board meetings, personal landscaping projects disguised as community improvements, even travel that had nothing to do with HOA business. If those details surfaced, her reputation and her control would both be destroyed. She stalled, but stalling only raised more suspicion. Soon after, neighbors began noticing unfamiliar cars in the neighborhood. Investigators were quietly interviewing residents, asking questions about the board, about fines, about foreclosures. People who had once kept quiet out of fear now found themselves speaking freely to outsiders who carried authority Cynthia couldn't intimidate. One by one, the stories piled up, forming a damning portrait of a corrupt HOA leadership. Mark watched it unfold with cautious satisfaction. He had spent months under siege, enduring humiliation, harassment, and financial pressure. Now, the tables were turning. But he didn't celebrate openly. He kept meticulous records, stayed in contact with his lawyer, and encouraged neighbors to tell the truth. The stronger their collective voice, the harder it would be for Cynthia to dismiss them as isolated troublemakers. Then came the moment no one expected. On a warm afternoon, police cruisers rolled into the neighborhood. Officers emerged with clipboards and sealed envelopes, heading straight to the HOA office. Cynthia's smile faltered as she watched from her porch. The sight of uniformed officers carrying out official documents was a blow to the image she had cultivated as untouchable. Whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once feared her now exchanged hopeful glances. Something was happening. And it was happening fast. The investigation revealed what many had long suspected. The HOA had not only been selectively enforcing rules, but had also mismanaged funds on a scale far larger than anyone imagined. Thousands of dollars in maintenance fees had been siphoned off into questionable expenses. Foreclosure threats had been issued without proper legal grounds. Violations had been fabricated to justify penalties that were never valid in the first place. When the news reached the homeowners, anger boiled over. A community that had once been paralyzed by fear now found itself united. They demanded answers. They demanded accountability. And for the first time, Cynthia had no authority to silence them. Every attempt she made to regain control, letters, threats, even pleading, was met with resistance. People no longer saw her as a protector. They saw her for what she was: the architect of their misery. As investigators dug deeper, Cynthia's inner circle began to fracture. Board members who had once backed her blindly now feared being dragged down with her. Some quietly resigned, hoping to escape the fallout. Others cooperated with investigators, trading information for leniency. Cynthia was left increasingly isolated, clinging to power that was slipping through her fingers. Mark, meanwhile, remained steady. He knew the fight wasn't finished, but the tide was undeniably in his favor. Regulators were preparing formal actions, and his lawyer hinted that civil suits for damages could soon be filed. The foreclosure threat that had once loomed like a storm cloud now looked flimsy and desperate. The house he loved was no longer at risk. If anything, it had become the symbol of a community's resilience. Still, Cynthia refused to surrender. Even as the walls closed in, she clung to her belief that she could outmaneuver everyone. She filed appeals, challenged the validity of the investigation, and accused Mark of orchestrating a smear campaign. But her words no longer carried weight. Every denial only highlighted her desperation. The final blow came when financial audits revealed personal purchases hidden in the HOAS accounts. Luxuries disguised as community expenses. Receipts signed by Cynthia herself. It was undeniable. She had exploited her position for personal gain, and now the entire neighborhood knew it. The police presence grew more visible, and rumors spread of pending charges. The once proud president of the HOA, who had strutted around with a clipboard and a smug smile, now looked over her shoulder at every sound of a siren. The empire she had built on intimidation and greed was crumbling, piece by piece. Mark stood at the center of it all, not as a victim but as the spark that had ignited change. He had fought back when no one else dared, and in doing so, he had shown the community that fear was not stronger than truth. The end was near for Cynthia's reign, but as the investigation moved toward its conclusion, one final question remained: would she go quietly, or would she try one last desperate move before it all came crashing down? The neighborhood had never seen anything like it. For years, Cynthia had strutted across the manicured lawns with her clipboard in hand, issuing fines with a smug certainty that no one could challenge her authority. But now, her empire was collapsing. The police cars parked outside the HOA office were a constant reminder that the days of unchecked power were over. Mark watched from his porch as the once feared president grew more desperate with each passing day. Where she had once barked orders at neighbors, she now walked quickly with her head low, avoiding eye contact. Rumors swirled that investigators had uncovered not just financial mismanagement but outright fraud, funds redirected into her personal accounts, receipts forged to justify luxury expenses. The whispers became louder, turning into open conversations, and then into collective outrage. The community demanded a reckoning. A special homeowners meeting was called not by Cynthia this time, but by the residents themselves. It was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Neighbors who had once avoided these gatherings now came in droves, eager to see the downfall of the woman who had tormented them for years. Cynthia attempted to preside over the meeting, as if nothing had changed, but the room no longer belonged to her. Voices rose, questions fired, accusations hurled. One by one, residents recounted their experiences of harassment and intimidation. Families who had lost homes under suspicious foreclosures were remembered with anger and sadness. Mark presented his evidence again, but this time, he wasn't standing alone. Dozens of neighbors stepped forward, each carrying their own stories, their own proof. The board, fractured and weakened, offered little defense. Several members resigned on the spot, unwilling to sink with the ship. The pressure became unbearable. When a motion was raised to remove Cynthia as president, the vote was swift and overwhelming. For the first time, she was powerless. The gavel she had wielded with iron controls slipped from her grasp, and the title she had clung to vanished. But the fall didn't end there. Days later, formal charges were filed. Embezzlement, fraud, abuse of power. The list was long and damning. Police arrived at her doorstep, and the sight of Cynthia being escorted out of her home in handcuffs sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The woman who had once been the face of control was now the face of disgrace. Mark didn't celebrate with shouts or cheers. Instead, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a deep relief that the nightmare was finally over. His house, once under the shadow of foreclosure, now stood as a symbol of victory, not just for him, but for everyone who had endured the HOA's tyranny. The cameras he had installed remained as silent witnesses to the battle he had fought and won. The aftermath brought change. A new board was elected, this time composed of neighbors determined to restore trust. Transparency became the cornerstone of their governance. Financial records were shared openly. Rules were applied fairly. And homeowners once again felt like participants in their community rather than subjects under a dictator. The transformation was remarkable. Lawns that had once been scrutinized with hostility now bloomed with individuality. Children played freely without fear of rule violations. Neighbors gathered for cookouts and events, no longer wary of being watched. The community, once fractured by fear, began to heal. As for Mark, he remained humble. Though many neighbors thanked him, calling him the man who saved their homes, he never sought glory. To him, it had been about more than just fighting the HOA, it had been about protecting what mattered most. Freedom, dignity, and the right to live without fear in one's own home. Cynthia's downfall became a cautionary tale, not just within the neighborhood but beyond. Stories spread to nearby communities, and people began questioning their own HOAs, inspired by Mark's fight. He had not only defended his house, but also ignited a broader awareness of how unchecked power could corrupt. In the end, the house that had nearly been taken from him remained his sanctuary. Its walls held memories of battle, resilience, and triumph. Mark often sat on his porch in the evenings, coffee in hand, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. He no longer worried about notices or threats appearing in his mailbox. The silence that once felt oppressive now felt peaceful, earned. The HOA had tried to take his house, but in their greed, they had lost everything. And Mark had proven that when one man stands firm, even the strongest facade of power can crumble.